On the 13-hour bus ride to Neba, I listened to 8 hours of a man tell his prophetic stories. I had never heard stories like these before. I'd never heard anything like this before. I'd been asking the Lord to speak to me for 5 years, every day, and I never heard anything like this before. And after I listened to that 8-hour series of this man give the most amazing stories I'd ever heard, I knew what I'd been asking for 5 years. I knew how I wanted the Lord to speak to me. I wanted it bad. We had a family friend at the little Baptist church that I grew up in. Her name was Loretta, and I asked her to pray for me when I was on my mission trip in Guatemala because I knew she would actually pray for me. I knew she would actually pray for me every single day. I just didn't know what else she was going to do. My trip to Guatemala was a lot harder than I expected it to be. Between the culture shock from seeing the intense poverty there to just the physical demands of climbing through the mountains, it was very hard, very stressful. There were several times where I found myself crying out to the Lord, asking Him to break in and help me in distress. It was not what I expected at all. As we hiked through the mountains of northern Guatemala, places that were beyond the paved roads, we shared the gospel in a variety of ways with the villagers there, and in every village we were taken in by whatever small church existed. And they were so gracious. They were amazing. They were beautiful people. They treated us wealthy Westerners so wonderfully. In one village in particular, when we arrived, by about 7 p.m., I think I'd been bitten by 1,000 gnats. I didn't even know that gnats bit before I arrived in this village, but we came to find out that this village was infested with biting gnats. That evening, 4 of us stayed in the home of the pastor. He had an extra bedroom, which was very strange. Their houses were dirt floor huts that they constructed themselves, the kind of places you could probably build in a weekend, and they literally had dirt floors. The eaves of these little huts were open, so when it rained, anything that wanted to come in could come in. For that matter, birds could come in anytime. Almost anything could get in. But that night in particular, it was raining cats and dogs. And so all of the gnats in the village sought refuge in our little bedroom that we were sleeping in. It was miserable. It was about 50 degrees outside that night, but because the gnats wouldn't stop biting, my only escape from them was to hide myself inside my 20-degree sleeping bag. I zipped myself up like a mummy inside it, and I closed it up around my nose, and I only had this much of my face showing out, and still the gnats would bite my nose and sneak inside. So finally I closed it entirely, and I just started to sweat like crazy because my breath was heating up the bag and getting so hot, and still the gnats were inside the bag. So I had to reach down and pinch the little suckers. It took forever. It was miserable. I hated every second of that evening. After what felt like 7 or 8 or 12 hours of dealing with this, I heard one of my compatriots stirring and moaning from the gnats biting him, and I asked him what time it was. He told me it was 11:45, an hour after we went to bed. I cried out to the Lord and I said, "This is the most miserable night of my life. Lord, you've got to do something. Please do something." It didn't take long. The Lord answered quickly. One of my friends that I was spending the night with in the pastor's house named Craig, just a few seconds later, he jumped up and shouted, "I can't take it anymore." And he ran and he knocked on the door to the pastor's room, and the pastor opened up to him and he walked inside and we heard mumbling going on. The crazy thing was Craig didn't speak Spanish or Ixil, their native language, and the pastor didn't speak Spanish, so we weren't sure what they were saying. But a few minutes later, Craig emerged from his room with a coffee can and a smoking corn cob, which apparently gnats hate, especially the biting gnats. As soon as he brought it into the room, within about 2 minutes, the room was full of the smoke and the gnats were gone. And the best part about it was, we were sleeping on the floor and there was just enough fresh air at the bottom of the room for us to breathe deeply. I said a little prayer as I drifted off to sleep, telling the Lord thank you for hearing me and answering my prayer. I thought about those gnats every day for the next month, because that's exactly how long it took for the welts and itchy scabs to go away. A few weeks later, when my parents picked me up at the airport in Houston, I was itching and scratching all over. My mother looked at me and said, "Where did you get those bites?" And I said, "Well, there was this one village up in the mountains that was infested with gnats. Thousands of them bit us." As soon as I said that, my mother's eyes got really big, like she'd already heard the story. Looked at me and she said, "You know, Loretta told us something that sounded a lot like that the other day. She said she had a dream where you were being attacked by thousands of little demons and they were biting you and you were sweating." She said, "But I told her that that can't be the case because where you were, it was supposed to be cold." When I heard that, I said, "Mom, call Loretta and tell her to come over to the house right now. I have to talk to her." Loretta came over just a couple hours later and she sat down and she asked me about my trip, and I said, no, I don't want to do that this way. You tell me. I told her, "You tell me the dream you had. I have to hear it from you first." I didn't want to tell her and then have her tell me and then wonder, did she tell me what she thought I wanted to hear or whatever. I said, "You tell me the story you told my mom." And she sat down and she opened up her dream journal. I didn't even know such things existed at that point, but she opened up her dream journal where she wrote down all of her dreams. And she read to me the experience. She said that she had this dream and she saw me. And she said, I was in this bag and I was sweating like crazy. And she said there were thousands of little demons that were biting me. She said that she heard me cry out in the midst of while I was being bitten by all these demons. She said that I cried out in the dream and I said, "Lord, you've got to do something. This is the most miserable night of my life. Please help." And she said right then she woke up and she looked at her clock and it was 11:45 p.m. Central Time, the same time zone as Guatemala. She woke up from that dream as it was happening in real time. She told me what happened to me. She used the words that I used. And I only prayed them silently. I never told my mother or anybody anything until this moment. And she told me all about it. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the Lord had seen me. I knew He had heard my prayer and He answered it because the situation resolved immediately when Craig went and got the smoking corn cob. But I couldn't believe that the Lord cared enough about me and thought enough about me to tell someone else. Loretta stayed over at our house for a while and she opened up her journal and she read to me 4 other times. 4 more times. Exactly like that one, where she described the people I was with. She described the situation that was going on and she told me my prayer 5 times on my trip to Guatemala, I cried out to the Lord for help, and he resolved it immediately. And all 5 of those times, Loretta had a dream where the Lord showed her what was going on, who I was with, and what I prayed. All 5 times in Guatemala, the Lord showed her. It changed me. I was amazed. I was undone. I couldn't believe that the Lord cared that much about me. I don't think I can do justice telling this story to explain how life-altering this experience was. And the trip to Guatemala was something else entirely. The going on a mission trip, it was wonderful, but coming back and hearing these stories from Loretta, how the Lord spoke to her everything that I prayed for, all these things that I was asking for. It was just amazing. The Lord knew me. The Lord heard me. Just days before, I was listening to these stories by a man named Mike Bickle, hearing his prophetic history, as he called it. Listening to some of the most amazing stories. I've been asking for the Lord to speak to me prophetically for 5 years, every day. And after I heard his stories, I said, Lord, this is what I want. These kind of stories, the kind of stories I want to have in my life. And days later, I was experiencing the same kind of thing. The kind of thing where something happens to me and someone else tells me all about it, even uses the same language that I used. This was the first time anything like that ever happened for me. Having a prophetic person tell me what the Lord was doing in my life, what he was speaking, what was going on. But it's far from the last. This was the beginning of a new journey for me, and that's why I love to tell these stories. This set me on a trajectory, on a path that I've never wanted to turn around from or look back from. There's been ups and downs, and it's been difficult at times, but hearing the voice of the Lord and knowing that he cares, knowing that he sees me, that he hears me, and then what I'm going through, what I'm doing, what I'm saying matters to him. I don't just want that for me. I do. I want more of it. I want to keep asking the Lord for more, but I want it for you. I want you, listening and watching this, to experience the same kind of thing. And it was those stories, I was listening to other people's stories that opened the door for me to say, Lord, I want that. I want that and more. I'm hoping that my stories will be your starting point, that you start asking for the kinds of things that I'm telling you about. I'm hoping that some of you, this is new to you, and you're saying, Lord, I want that. And then you'll start down this road and you'll go so far, so much further than anything I've experienced. I want to experience more, but I want you to experience these kinds of things and so much more. I've got many other stories to tell, and I want to encourage you with them, so that you can go deep with God, not so that you can have cool stories to tell, but so you can grow in intimacy with the Lord and know him more, and grow in love for him, and grow in relationship with him. That's my heart behind these stories, and that's what I want for you. Commit to asking the Lord every day to speak to you. And even if it takes years before he starts, keep going. Keep going. If you're a young person, commit now to start asking the Lord to speak to you every day. And I know he will. But until then, I'll see you next time.